Buying new stuff feels great, right? The problem is that every year we're consuming more, producing more, and there's a flip side to that that no one wants you to see.
Well, don't say you weren't warned. MasterCard and the United Nations are joining forces to monitor the carbon effect of your credit card purchases. And then you'll hit your carbon max and it'll stop working. This is a social credit score, and it's a proof of concept. The Doconomy CO2 credit card website claims it is the largest initiative ever taken by a bank in educating its users on the impact of consumption. They say themselves they want to set a global standard for carbon calculations. That's the key. Once they have their numbers in place, then they can give every single purchase you make a score and punish you directly. This is what China does. And of course, this will only be enforced on you and me and any businesses that don't go along with their scheme. And banks are going to enforce it.
As ballots are torched in Washington state and a couple of ribeyes goes for $75 now at the grocery store, we're being fleeced by international criminals as they prepare to put us all in digital chains. Oxfam International, a British-led confederation of 21 independent NGOs, reported that World Bank bureaucrats have misplaced between 24 billion to 41 billion in funds intended for climate change efforts. The misplaced funds were attributed to poor record-keeping practices and an odd accounting practice by the bank. A World Bank insider suggested that the amount of money could be twice or 10 times more. And climate change hysteria is now showing to have devastating effects on the natural world as well, something the globalists claim to be desperately protecting.
What the United States is looking at is thousands of wind turbines in an area that our whales, our dolphins, our marine life, where they live, where they migrate, where they breed.
These are the kind of guys you like to smack in the ass.
Meanwhile, corrupt and compromised lame duck President Joe Biden has allocated at least $113.4 billion to Ukraine, while the Hurricane Helene-ravaged Appalachians are essentially left to fend for themselves.
Yeah, Americans should be worried about money, and here's why. A new Wells Fargo study found that over half of Americans, 56% to be exact, are worried about their finances right now. And the study showed that due to the current state of the economy, 2/3 of Americans have cut back on their spending habits. And over 1/3 of people have resorted to dipping into their retirement funds. Does that sound like you? I mean, that's just to make ends meet right now. And so many of them are using these savings not to go buy extravagant things. They're using it to pay medical bills or the rent. And when you consider some of the major factors affecting people right now, it's no surprise that Americans are worried about money.
The middle class, which was once a symbol of the American dream, is now painting quite a different picture today. They've lost more than the people who make more than them. They've saved less than the people who make less than them. And they're being hit the hardest by inflation. Take a look. The Wall Street Journal says there's never been a worse time to buy a home versus rent. More Americans are financing their cars than ever before, and the average new car payment is $726 a month. On top of that, buy now, pay later is booming because Americans are okay with financing their vacations to Cancun. How did this happen? How is the middle class feeling the squeeze today? Life has become much more expensive in just the last few years, and because of that, it's become more difficult to own things. And because it's more difficult to own things, more and more Americans are getting caught up in this payment game of let me not own this thing, let me just pay to use this thing. And so now you get caught up in this payments game where you're paying money every single month when you don't actually own anything. But here is a survey conducted and what 90% of GOP voters said. According to the survey, middle-class life has become increasingly costly, with wages failing to keep pace. Only 10% of Americans believe the country is becoming wealthier, with the government providing more support for families. In polls, when people are asked about being middle class, they frequently are less likely to say so, and more people now urge the pollsters to suggest that they're working class. So, I think that many people who maybe in prior years would have thought of themselves as middle class now no longer think of themselves that way. So, what do you think about economic status? The economic status is somehow static. You know, the state of the world that you're either poor or not poor. You're middle class or you're not. But in fact, the reality is that many middle-class families will experience 1 or a few years in poverty. In fact, most American families will have years where they'll be poor or nearly poor. That precarity, that uncertainty, is now a feature of the middle-class experience for most U.S. families. Now, what happened to the American middle class? A study by the Pew Research Center discovered that the middle class, which was once comprised of the majority of Americans, has steadily shrunk since the 1970s. About 61% of American adults were considered middle class in 1971, compared to just 51% in 2019. However, the issue remains widely debated when people think about the state of the middle class and whether or not it's shrinking. Meanwhile, do you know that what it takes to actually live a middle-class life, to have the quality of life in many American cities, is not what it once was? For instance, meet Chantel Jacob. Chantel lives in suburban Texas with her husband and 1 child. And while a household income of just over $100,000 should put her family in the middle-income tier, she says that her family is still struggling toward financial stability. Sounds great, 6 figures, $100,000, huh? But according to her, as she got married, the taxes that come out of her check before she even gets any money, before any of her benefits, $500, come out of her check automatically. And then she adds life insurance for her spouse, herself, and her son. And she also has money going aside for her son's college fund. Her check, which starts at about $3,000, goes down to $2,200 before she even touches it. The rent is about $1,700. Electricity is about $150. Phone bills, about $280. Internet, $60. They both have vehicles. Those are about $800. Insurance on those vehicles is about $400. However, when it comes to food, $400 to $500 disappears a month, but that's increasing. They often budget down to the dollar. Sometimes it's very disheartening to work all week and have people tell you like, oh, you're so lucky you have a great job. And you're like, I don't know about that. Seeing this makes you ponder. Middle-class Americans find it difficult to be able to pay their rent easily. They can't own property. If they're in their 30s, they may not feel comfortable having kids because they'll realize that having a child would be too expensive. And what about medical bills? Forget about medical care. If you have one thing that happens to you physically, often people don't have good enough medical care. They don't have any insurance. This all goes into making somebody part of the wiped out middle class. Let's jump into the numbers. In 2019, just a few years ago, the median household income in America was $68,700. The average price for a new car sold in America was $38,988. The average cost for a home sold in America was $258,000. And the average price for a gallon of gas over the course of the year was $2.60. Now, let's compare that to 2023. In 2023, the estimated household income is around $76,000, which is an increase of $11,000 from 2019. In 2023, the average price for a new car sold was $48,287. That's an increase of 19% from 2019. In 2023, the average cost of a home sold in America jumped to $412,000. That's an increase of 60% from 2019. And in 2023, the average price of a gallon of gas sold was $3.76 over the course of a year. Because you've got to remember, gas prices fluctuate a lot throughout the year. Now, this is an increase of 44% from 2019. Besides all this, the financial pressure on the middle class is astounding. The middle class has lost the biggest share of its assets in the stock market. The loss has been larger than even the top 1% of households, which own more than half of all equity and mutual fund shares, according to Federal Reserve data. So even though middle-class households own fewer stocks, they lost a bigger percentage of what they have in the first quarter downturn. Fed data also showed that the middle class is taking on more debt. Households earning between $75,000 and $127,000 now hold the most consumer credit debt of all groups, outpacing even households that earn twice as much or more. And data from Moody's Investors Service shows that upper middle-income Americans have less savings than every group except the lowest-income Americans, and they reduced their savings in the fourth quarter of 2021 and the first quarter of 2022 by more than any other group. So, what are the reasons behind the middle-class wipeout? There are several reasons why the middle class is feeling wiped out. The first reason is stagnated income. Back in 1985, a typical male worker could cover a family of 4 expenses for health insurance, transportation, housing, food, and even save for college with just 40 weeks of income. But fast forward to 2022, and that same worker would need a staggering 62 weeks of income just to afford the same standard of living. Think about it. How would you feel if you had to work more than a year just to afford what used to take less than a year? It's a tough pill to swallow. Watching the American economy, it's clear that something has gone seriously wrong over the past few decades. While economists and policymakers were busy chasing after economic growth, they forgot to ask a crucial question. Who's actually benefiting from all this growth? Sure, the economy grew, and yeah, we all got more stuff. But let's be honest here. Are we really better off? Are families really thriving in this so-called booming economy? Or are they just barely scraping by, struggling to make ends meet? How would you feel if you had to juggle multiple jobs, rely on government programs, and still find it tough to make ends meet? Oh, it's a harsh reality for far too many hardworking families out there. And what about that sense of security we all used to enjoy? Remember when having a steady job and a roof over your head meant you were set? Well, guess what? That security blanket seems to be slipping away for many folks. And the worst of it is that it seems that there are a lot of politicians stuck on repeat. Oh, they're offering the same old solutions: more tax cuts, more deregulation, more globalization. But those strategies haven't exactly been a home run for most folks. What we really need, what hard-working Americans deserve, is the chance to build stable, fulfilling lives. We're talking about jobs that pay enough for a single income to support a family like it used to. We're talking about economic growth that reaches every corner of our country, not just the big cities. So let's get real here. What does the American dream mean to you? Is it about uprooting your life and moving away from everything and everyone you know? Or is it about building a life right where you are, surrounded by family and friends? The idea of freedom has been thrown around a lot, but for many Americans, it feels more like an empty promise. In today's economy, people are feeling more constrained than ever, with limited options and shrinking opportunities. The situation is even worse in cities where the cost of living is already higher. An analysis in 2018 found that raising a family and a middle-class lifestyle in expensive coastal cities like San Francisco or New York requires an income of at least $300,000 a year. For reference, just 10% of all households made $200,000 or over in 2020. Another study by the Brookings Institute found that income in the middle class has grown half as fast compared to both the bottom 20% and the top 20% of income tiers once taxes and transfers were taken into account. On the other hand, policymaking affected lots of Americans, especially the middle class. The stagnation of wages and paychecks for people started back in the 1970s when productivity started growing more slowly, but really accelerated after 1970 and 1980 when there was a huge growth of inequality, when the top 1% took off, when the stock market grew, but people's paychecks did not. That has to do with issues of deregulation and excessive unemployment, the weakening of unions, and the failure to raise the minimum wage. Globalization with low-wage countries, that really puts the kibosh on blue-collar job opportunities in many places. The point is that it's not that the economy got worse, it was that there were policy decisions made so that the economic growth did not filter down to the vast majority. In response, the Biden administration came into office in 2021 with a promise to revitalize the middle class. The $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill from November 2021 and the Build Back Better Act both include provisions aimed at financially supporting middle-income families. But as Congress continues to find itself in a stalemate, only time will tell whether these bills will really have an impact on the survival of middle-income households. So where do we go from here?